if you're in the White House and you're looking at the casualty reports still coming in on a daily, weekly basis, and you're losing several thousand US military servicemen fighting in the Pacific, on top of which tens of thousands of civilians are dying throughout the wars raging in the Philippines, Chinese mainland, you're going to think, I can't really afford, in all good conscience, to wait another 5 months until they're so on their knees that they will surrender. We need to end this.
Hello. On the 6th of August 1945, the Enola Gay, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber, approached Hiroshima and opened up its bomb doors. Once its payload had dropped, the city was engulfed with a blinding light, and a huge explosion produced a giant mushroom cloud. When the attack was over, and after the Enola Gay had returned to its airbase on the North Mariana Islands, around 100,000 Japanese residents of Hiroshima were killed, and humanity had entered a new phase of warfare. Joining today is Iain MacGregor, author of The Hiroshima Men, as we discuss the people involved and the thinking that led to this moment. Coming up, we have Nelson's Pathfinders, the sailors whose skills defeated the French, a discussion on Iran's grand strategy, and plenty more. So please do share, like and subscribe. But until then, it's me talking with Iain MacGregor on Hiroshima. Iain, great pleasure to have you on again. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Ollie. Nice to be here.
And so this is for your new book, well-timed, of course, The Hiroshima Men. Mm-hmm. And this is the quest to build the atomic bomb and the fateful decision to use it. And it's so much more than that. Right. Okay. So the subtitle gives an indication for the listeners about what it was. So why is it a lot more than that then?
Well, we really, the publisher and myself, my publisher in the States at Scribner, we really went back and forwards on it, because it's like you're trying to encapsulate. Because my story is literally a 30-year story arc, really. So it's straight after the First World War. And it's talking about, through multiple characters, multiple places. It's very cinematic. And it's talking about the development of the world that's leading up to the war in the Pacific and in Europe, obviously, and how technology is just leaping forward as we go towards the war in terms of the race for this super weapon. And then talking about the war itself, and then talking about obviously the dropping of the bombs, but the world we had a year, 2 years after the bombs as well. So it's beyond the Second World War, and it's told through the experiences and the testimonies of 4 key people, but outside of the 4 key people, there's probably about another 10.
And the 4 key people, well, actually there are 5 key people, but 4 Americans are on the front cover.
And no, three Americans are on the cover with the Japanese.
You've got the one with, oh God, my mind's given me a blank.
So yeah, you've got, because there's Groves with Oppenheimer. Yeah.
Oppenheimer and Groves together, which if anyone's watched the film Oppenheimer last year, it's just great preparation for reading your book. They make a team, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And the 4 people's kind of core stories that take you on this journey are Paul Tibbets Jr., who would fly the Enola Gay to drop the bomb, General Groves, Leslie Groves, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was head of the weapons laboratory at Los Alamos, that would create the bombs. Senkichi Iwaya, who's a very, very intriguing character, who was a civil administrator from the mid-1920s all the way through to when he died instantly at Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped, because he was the mayor of Hiroshima at the time. And then finally, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and war journalist, John Hersey, who wrote for The New Yorker. And he would be the one who broke the story to the world. I mean, I talk about it in the book. There were several other people trying to get the story as well, but he really was the one who's credited for bringing the news to the world of this is what radiation poisoning is doing post the bomb going off.
So I guess the the latter three characters you've just mentioned come in preparation of the dropping of the bomb and then the bomb being dropped itself. But the early part of the book deals with the sort of designing,
Yeah,
creating,
yeah.
inventing the
Yeah,
bomb.
because I talk about I'm trying to lay the groundwork as best I can in one book. You could write volumes on this, as you know. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork of what the situation was in terms of the political landscape, that there's a war in Europe, going to be a war in the Pacific, the kind of ideological, stroke racial, stroke military arguments that are going on. So it's giving the reader a kind of understanding of why, which is what I hope I've succeeded in. Why do we get to going from conventional warfare to dropping an atomic bomb? And I hope I can explain to the reader through these people there is actually a logical pathway in a kind of, because you can argue the moral point that you can't drop an atomic bomb, but I'm trying to show you, well, if you follow this pathway, you can actually see through these people that it was, on the American side anyway, it was logical that they were going to drop the bomb.
Well, the arguments in favour of it, and it'd be great to get into the weeds of should have been done or should not have been done. But Harry S. I mean, and you mentioned conventional warfare right at the beginning of the quote. There's right at the beginning of the book. There's a quote that you've put in there from the great Stanley Baldwin, and this is that the bomber will always get through. This gives a really great insight into the thinking in the
Yeah.
1930s about bombing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, because I've done about a dozen talks now since the book's come out. And obviously, the questions about the morality of bombing always gets asked. And it's partly to answer that question you've just posed. It's we are looking at this from the great hindsight of 80 years where we can cast judgment. But as you mentioned about Stanley Baldwin, which is why I put the quote in, the the uh, the abject fear that a lot of governments had in terms of war's not just going to be fought on a battlefield anymore, as we were seeing in conventional warfare in the Great War. Obviously, Britain got bombed a little bit by Zeppelins and bombarded by German battleships, but in essence, the civilian population didn't suffer to a great degree. And then as you go through the 20s and into the 30s, and you've got the various wars that are happening, whether it's in, Manchuria, mainland China, Spain, uh, Africa, civilians are now being targeted, and it's always from the air. And it's the Germans that are driving that in terms of Hitler's rebuilding his Luftwaffe, and terror bombing is the tactic to get what to bring your enemy to the table and make them surrender, and that's the fear. So you've got the governments of Britain, France, definitely the United States. Everyone's looking to this new weapon, this long-range bomber that can fly over frontiers that armies might establish on the battleground and bomb behind the lines. And that was the great fear that as you're going towards continental war in continental Europe and then in the Pacific, it's aerial strength that's going to be the driving force.
And you mentioned, these I guess, official start of the war in 39, these bombing in China and Spain. But as the war progresses, certainly the Allies have no problem with the bombing of cities,
No,
which, I mean, they sort of call it precision bombing, but it's not as
never,
precise as
yeah,
one would like.
ever. It never is. You can see that today. Hospitals being hit by cruise missiles. Uh, but what I talk about in the book as well is the plans that were years before the war actually happened, especially in the United States, where the planning for their ultimate bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, which I go into great detail. I mean that was a few years before Pearl Harbor ever happened, but because some strategists were thinking eventually we are going to go to war with somebody like Japan, and therefore we are going to need a four-engine long-range bomber that can have a massive payload that can possibly take the war to the Japanese home islands. And so that's why, through testimonies and archive research, you can see that there was definitely a strategy and a planning involving a lot of government money that would develop that. And so by the time you're midway through the Pacific War. All this is in place. All this is ready to then take the war to Japan with the B-29 that would literally decimate, way, before the atomic bombs were dropped. B-29s were laying waste to Japanese cities. I think it's something like 65, 66 cities were attacked with incendiaries. And I talk about that as well, is the development and the willing development, the embrace of incendiary bombs. The Americans perfected it with the help of the British.
And part of the problem with these incendiary bombs is, and this is true of Japan, but also true of cities like Hamburg, isn't it? In that the buildings that are being targeted are wood, and so, but
But
that's not a consideration that the bomb, or was it? I don't know.
well, yeah, at the same time as they're starting the B-29 program in the late 30s, they've already done reports on using architects, American architects that had helped build prestigious buildings like the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. They'd recruited architects to say, well, what have you done over there? Do you want to write us up reports and show us diagrams of how traditional Japanese housing is constructed? So they had that all on a plate, really. And so, again, what I describe in the book in one chapter is how methodically the American military, once they're in a war after Pearl Harbor, they're developing with Hollywood set builders and, like I said, award-winning architects, building to the absolute accuracy Japanese housing and German housing in the deserts of Utah. And they are on top secret bombing ranges. And they get destroyed, rebuilt, get destroyed, rebuilt, and they're assessing every time they're doing it, perfecting how they might attack them with bombers, and then what incendiaries are the best ones to use. So, and like I said, that's a couple of years before they actually came online, and they were, using them on Japan.
But if we talk about the development of the atomic bomb, I mean, this is a program that I guess all major nations were interested in, but particularly Germany and the United States. But the United States had been, I mean, under Oppenheimer's program. This is a program that sort of drops into the lap of Harry S. Truman when he takes over from Roosevelt. He didn't even know about it, did he?
Yeah, well. I mean, famously, Roosevelt may have been an amazing, charismatic politician, a very, very effective president. Clearly, he got re-elected 3 times, but he's very secretive, and he had very few trusted subordinates. I think Admiral William Leahy was probably one of his most trusted advisors. But he had a very select quorum around him that he would not even let them know everything. He'd give everyone snippets of things. And Truman was his vice president for his last election when he got re-elected in '44, and he kept him in the dark. And ironically, Truman, as a senator, was running one of the oversight committees on military spending, and he was a very tough customer, and he was very analytical, knew the detail, and I'm sure there must have been a point where he's wondering, well, hang on, there's a few million, not a few billion, disappearing down some channel that I don't know about. But you're right. I mean, I said this in the talk at the weekend. I very much admire Truman when you consider what he took on, literally because Roosevelt had a stroke and died quite quickly, and you got Truman enters this new arena, having been kept in the dark, and he's got to finish the European War. He's got to go to Potsdam and sit down with Churchill and Stalin, men he'd never met before, and he's also got to, the big ask is, how do we defeat Japan in the Pacific, which is, has been a bloodbath the last couple of years with that island hopping campaign and MacArthur trying to retake the Philippines, hundreds of thousands of people dying. So he's thinking, right, how am I going to do that? And so he took it on. And like you said, he gets told, on top of everything else, he gets told, oh, by the way, we have this top secret super weapon that can level a city with one bomb. And as an ex-artilleryman from the Great War, he knew the value of TNT. So that I can't imagine he would not have been shocked, surprised, but equally possibly captivated and cheered up by the fact, wow, we've got something like this in our locker. That's incredible.
by the time he's aware, the successful test has not been completed, has it?
No, he was at Potsdam when the Trinity test was going underway. So the famous Trinity test scene in Oppenheimer, the movie, is amazing. It is amazing because obviously CGI. And if you watch it at the movies like I did, I was in the middle of my research for this book when I watched it. I was, scribbling notes every now and again.
Well,
But
you must have been delighted that this movie came out because, this gets everyone interested in it.
well, yeah, but I was going to say I was delighted for a different reason, Ollie. I was delighted by the fact that it is a good film. It's a good entry level film for anyone who wants to understand it, and it's great that the characterization of Oppenheimer and to a degree grows, but they could have gone deeper on grows. But the fact is, it's an American, it's not American bias, but it's from the American side. And as I said to friends, I said again, I'm saying in talks is you see the Trinity test, but at no point do you see the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima. At no point do you see what Hiroshima looked like afterwards and what happened to the people. And so that's why I kind of left watching the movie thinking, well, I've got the well, hopefully you always hope I've got the answer to a lot of this because I've done the research.
And so, whilst the Japanese cities are being bombed, is there any kind of, I mean, they're losing hundreds of thousands. I think in the Tokyo bombing, is it over
Yes.
100,000 people killed?
Well, it could be as high again. It's if you the archives I checked was it could be officially as high as 150,000. But because they had almost like mass migration out of the cities before then and during the campaign to bomb Tokyo, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, were leaving the cities to go into the countryside. So they lost sight of a lot of people. So a couple of professors of history in Japan that I interviewed said, unofficially, if you believe some of the figures, it could be as high as 300,000. But for now, I'm believing, which was what I say in the book. I just believe because that's all you can do. I look at the official records and it's over 100,000, but that's just one city. And if you look at I mean, more Japanese civilians died in the last 6 months of the war than in the previous 3.5 years of fighting because of the bombing campaign. So you're looking at, like I said, 66 cities were seriously damaged, if not practically destroyed by incendiary bombings and some high explosive raids. 8.5 million people dehoused and 900,000 to a million killed, men, women, and children. So that is a lot. I mean,
It's
you can see,
staggering. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But that is, as we said right from the beginning, that's the power of the long range bomber getting through.
And is there a understanding because of the sheer amount of bombing, and of course you've got the mayor of Hiroshima on the front cover, is there a kind of understanding that this is just a relentless case of bombing that's going to continue, so we will have to remain strong and resolved, and we will not surrender? Because as many listeners may know, even after the first bomb was dropped, there
Yeah,
was
yeah.
no plan to
Yeah,
surrender.
but half of that, obviously, a lot of that is from the real zealots around the imperial throne and in government who are, led by the military, the real hardliners. And as again, it's been reported by the likes of Max Hastings as well in his book Nemesis. But you've got that conversation. It's a dual story. You've got at the highest levels of government, you've got this competition, deadly competition between the hardliners and some of the liberals in the doves in the government who know they're going to lose the war and they need to surrender with dignity. Both sides, hardliners and doves, see the position of the emperor as fundamental to any surrender. So the Potsdam Conference issued the unconditional surrender, and it made no mention of the emperor could stay in position. So that almost played into the hands of the hardliners, saying, well, we carry on the fight because the emperor is going to stay. If the emperor goes, societal collapse will end up like Russia. Uh, but equally, what I talk about primarily in my book is, well, what were other people thinking below that in society, whether you're military in the civilian administration or just an ordinary civilian trying to survive, which is why I brought in the mayor's story. Because you've got to remember, until Emperor Hirohito officially announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, a lot of Japanese, if not the majority of Japanese civilians, had no idea. It came as a massive shock. they knew they were being bombed, but they thought that the Allies weren't in such a position of strength where they would have to surrender unconditionally. So it came as, again, I record that with interviews I did in Japan, it's just a shock, especially in the rural countryside parts of Japan. They had absolutely no clue that that was going to happen. But the raids, yeah, I mean, the raids were fundamental to driving that. You could argue that they didn't, you know, they didn't need to drop the atomic bombs if they were prepared to wait another 5-6 months and wait out the Japanese, because they were bombing them into the Stone Age. They'd already had a program of laying sea mines all around the home islands, Operation Starvation. B-29s were doing that. The supply routes had been cut off to feed the home islands. And then they'd started using incendiaries to bomb the rice harvest. So the country is going to collapse. But if you're getting back to Truman, if you're in the White House and you're looking at the casualty reports still coming in on a daily, weekly basis, and you're losing several thousand US military servicemen fighting in the Pacific, on top of which tens of thousands of civilians are dying throughout the wars raging in the Philippines, Chinese mainland, you're going to think, I can't really afford, in all good conscience, to wait another 5 months until they're so on their knees that they will surrender. We need to end this, and that's the argument I take, which I think is a logical one. I don't believe there was any other reason than Truman just wanted to finish it, which is why he authorized the uses of the bombs.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
Yeah, so how important was Okinawa in this assessment? Because they gained Okinawa, which is an island just south of Japan.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of men lost in that.
Yeah,
in that
but
victory.
that was almost like there was a slow march of the island hopping campaign of 2.5 years to get to Okinawa, that it was always going to lead to that, because and Saul David's book on Okinawa was fantastic to build that kind of picture of why it was such a bloodbath. You've got a society that's been inculcated away from any other propaganda message than their own government telling them it's a fight to the finish, and these imperialist invaders, they'll rape and pillage. We've got to fight them to our last breath, and they were completely up for that. And Okinawa is the perfect example of that's what happens when you've educated and put the fear of God into your population, that the defenders on the island will fight to the last man, kind of, and inflict heavy casualties on land and sea of American forces, and B, the civilians that are still surviving on the island, a lot of them will kill themselves rather than be captured. So if you're a US Marine and an Army soldier or commander on Okinawa, at the end of all that, and you're looking out to sea, and they've lost, the US Navy's lost dozens of ships damaged or sunk, thousands have been killed on your side, and you're thinking, and this is just to take Okinawa, and we haven't even got to the mainland yet. All of that would have filtered back up the chain of command to thinking, yeah, I mean, Operation Olympic had a very good name. I mean, it's the Olympic of all amphibious invasions. But all I would say is, I think that's what stuck in the craw of Japanese after the surrender, is a lot of military men anyway, especially a couple that I interviewed for the book, was the shame of actually, for them anyway, of surrendering, but no enemy had actually stepped foot on Japanese mainland soil, and they still surrendered. And that's what the feeling I got from a couple of people that I interviewed who were in their 90s.
Yes, so what age were they then in 45?
Well, they wouldn't have even been, some of them wouldn't have even been serving. Some of them were actually conveying to me the thoughts and letters from their fathers that had fought either in the Imperial Army or the Imperial Navy. I had one guy, Henry Kakita, his uncle he survived, but he was a squadron leader of a kamikaze force based outside Kagoshima, a place called Shiran, which does have, by the way, a memorial museum to the kamikaze force, and it's almost like a shrine. It's an incredible place to go to. just if you wanted to see even today the veneration for those people that did it. And so that's the kind of and I thought that was important. I wanted to see what kind of mindset would drive uh, those forces that were set on, like with the kamikaze diving into a ship. And so this guy Henry, his uncle survived. He trained kamikaze pilots, but then he would be flying at about 10,000 feet above them as they're going into action with his clipperboard, saying who did what to whom, who did their duty, and then he would fly back and train the rest. And funnily enough, he survived the war. There you go.
Well, that's a good job to have if you're a kamikaze
Exactly.
pilot.
But yeah, so I would say the majority of the Japanese voices that I interviewed and those voices that I found in the archives were primarily civilian, because I thought that was I needed that for the book, and I hadn't seen a lot of that in other books that have come out. It's generally the military that have their voices told. And I do have those in my book, but I wanted to get fresh voices.
So were the civilians thinking then the bombing and then the atomic bomb itself, this was a whole new level of bombing?
Well, yeah, but there was the whole the city was, well, obviously the center of the city was destroyed. 80 odd thousand people die, instantly, and then you've got tens of thousands of others that are badly wounded, and those that will die very quickly from radiation poisoning. But the bulk of the 300,000 that were in the city at the time, or just less than that, the survivors escape. If any of the listeners have been to Hiroshima, they're surrounded. They've got a range of these beautiful mountains that surround the city. That's where they were escaping to, long lines of them just going off into the city and whatever they could carry and whatever they were standing up in. But to those outside, especially the government in Tokyo, no one knew what had happened. They just thought, oh, the Americans have dropped some kind of super bomb. They had no clue it was an atomic bomb. They sent teams down within about a couple of days, managed to get through. Because the south of Japan was invested with the Japanese Imperial Army, because obviously they're planning for the American invasion of the south. So there was a lot of teams that could quickly get to Hiroshima. And I think, within a few hours, the commander of the area of the southern section of Japan, Field Marshal Hatta, his HQ was there was one communication cable that wasn't destroyed. They're telling Tokyo, something big has just been dropped on us. And that's when they realized, wow, they did one bomb. And you've got to remember, the Americans are telling them too, because Truman gives them, does the radio broadcast quickly soon afterwards, saying, explaining why they dropped the bomb, because the Japanese refused their ultimatum from Potsdam. And he issues the very famous / infamous phrase, if they don't now accept it, there will be a reign of ruin over Japan. And he's not inferring just incendiaries. He's talking about, he's inferring we got more of what we've just dropped on Hiroshima. And obviously, as we all know, as history tells us, that warning did not go down well in Tokyo around the emperor, and they carried on fighting.
To what extent is there a racialized element to this? In that I understand that there is a military requirement to preserve, your army from what was likely to be hundreds of thousands of casualties in the invasion of Japan. But was there an element in the thinking that these people aren't like us, their culture's different, they look very different to us? I mean, obviously that's not going to be expressed in communiques, but is there a sort of a thinking that you picked up on? Because we see this absolutely. Later with Curtis LeMay in Korea.
Yeah. No, I mean, 100%. There's a racial element to the campaign, but then again, my last book on Stalingrad, there's a racial element there too. I mean, that was a war, that's a genocidal war on the Eastern Front in Russia. I would say that in the Pacific, the Japanese, and I've argued a point, because it's the book isn't trying to paint the Japanese as victims. My book's not about that, but he's trying to strike a balance and show, if you do, as you're intimating, if you go and look in the archives, the American archives, you will find so much information in terms of letters, diaries, testimonies, publications, the US Marine Corps magazine, the Bootneck. you look at some of the covers of the bootneck during the war. The Japanese are apes. I mean, they literally are cartoon apes swinging from the trees. And the Japanese had the same. The Japanese had just as bad, uh, racial caricatures of the Americans and the Allies. Uh, you could argue, the Japanese are trying to sell their form of empire to the Pacific as we are kicking out the white imperialist man from the Pacific, and a new destiny awaits us. But as a lot of people saw in all the provinces and countries they took over after they launched Pearl Harbor, they were as bad, worse than any colonial power that had been in charge in the Pacific too. They killed hundreds of thousands, if not million. Japan, over 50 million people died fighting the Japanese once they invaded the mainland. So I do say, I quote an American historian, and I'm afraid to say he's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember it, but it's in the footnotes of my book. The Pacific War, you could argue the Pacific War was just one giant race riot.
Wow.
And I'm quoting a very reputable, esteemed American historian saying that. And I had your reaction just now when I read that. I went, wow, I've never thought about that before. And then obviously when I talk about it and I was doing more research, you can see the level of desire that, with no weapons off the table, basically, in winning this thing. If the Japanese had had a nuclear weapon, of course, they would have dropped it. They had the incendiaries in the B-29, they would have used those too. And I would think that, you could argue the good war, but even Tibbets, who flew the Enola Gay, said there's no morality. Said this, many, many, many times after the war when he's giving interviews, being asked, do you feel any guilt about dropping the bomb? And from a moral standpoint, he's like, there's no morality in war. You have to win the war, and you have to kill people. It doesn't matter what you're using to kill people. There's no morality in it.
I think that's something that we as a society struggle with today, certainly. And as we're seeing in the many conflicts that are breaking out.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because this kind of argument doesn't matter whether you're looking at the Great War, Second World War, Korea, which you just mentioned with Curtis LeMay, Vietnam, and today, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's because we've got the technology advanced so much in terms of air power and rockets and everything else that civilians are the first casualties, really.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the converse argument that I've heard, there is bombing taking place in Germany and they look like us and they speak a different language, but, Dresden and Hamburg, two of the sort of big examples.
But I got asked that question though, and I'd say that the Allies propagated a bombing policy over Europe just as heavy as it was in Japan. It's the same. I mean, they're using the same armaments. I argued about that to a couple of people who said the bombing over Japan was more ferocious. I said, well, actually, it wasn't. They're using obviously different plane with bigger payloads, but you got Tokyo. Granted, is a much bigger loss of life, but as you said, beginning of the war, you got Rotterdam getting firebombed, but then it just gets bigger and bigger with the RAF and the 8th Air Force campaigns over Europe. I mean, they're using the same armaments to a degree.
But then the first bomb, it didn't work in that the Japanese didn't surrender.
Yes, because again, it's one bomb has wiped out a city. And you've got to remember, Tokyo, a third of Tokyo was wiped out in one night by the Great Tokyo Fire Raid. So this is a regime that has become experienced in seeing whole cities or halves of cities literally gone in one bombing raid. But this time, obviously, it's not 300 bombers dropping tons and tons of bombs. You've got one bomber, one bomb. And they don't know the Americans have only got one bomb left, the plutonium bomb, Fat Man. They might be under the impression, because they have nothing else to cling to, that the Americans have got a lot more of them. And obviously you got Truman saying, expect a rain of ruin.
You mentioned Tibbets, and he takes this kind of balanced view, but that wasn't necessarily the case for the rest of his crew, was it?
Well, again, if you, I know it's thing because I'm the same as everybody else. You read the, the top level kind of storylines, and firstly, there's a great guy in the Western United States that did a kind of Band of Brothers, a Stephen Ambrose version of Band of Brothers, in terms of he's an ex-military airman, and he befriended a lot of the men that served in Tibbet's unit, the 509th Composite Group. So they're the ones. There's about 4 different units within that, and hundreds of men. And from the 1950s onwards, he organized reunions for all of them. And what he did was he also interviewed a great many of them. So he's got this incredible archive. And I worked with him on getting some of their testimonies. But then I also went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans and sat for a week there listening to audio recordings done in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and some of which was the crew from the Enola Gay. And so famously, the one that really stood out for me was Tibbet's co-pilot, Lewis. He's the one who's obviously goes down in history as said, "Oh my God, what have we done?" And he jotted that down in the log after the bombing. And Van Kirk, who's one of Tibbet's closest friends, who'd served with him in Europe, who was also on the plane, sitting behind them, in his audio interview stored in the archives in New Orleans, he said, well, yeah, he wrote that down in the log once we'd landed back on Tinian, and we're surrounded by, hundreds of press, and generals are pumping our hands saying, well done, boys, great job. He wrote that in the log afterwards. What he actually shouted in the cockpit when we saw the bomb had dropped was, look at that son of a bitch go. And again, I know you're smiling. I was smiling when I read it. I was thinking, it shows you how myth can become reality, and it paints a completely different picture, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And,
it does. I mean, it's almost yeah.
Yeah, and I interviewed Tibbet's grandson, who's also called Paul. He's Paul number 4, and he's retired. Got to the same level in rank in the Air Force as his grandfather, so he's retired a brigadier general. Weirdly, he commanded the same bomber squadron as his grandfather, but he's flying stealth bombers. But he was great because I wanted to interview him, not really to get the facts, because I knew the facts. I just wanted to understand his grandfather's character. And he gave me some fantastic anecdotes. And he said his grandfather, he used to say to him that the mission, special mission number 13, to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, was the easiest mission he ever flew and his crew ever flew. It was unopposed, 6 hours there from Tinian.
No anti-aircraft.
No, they didn't nothing. Weather planes that had gone ahead of them, no one bothered them either. Dropped the bomb, flew back, landed, and were embraced as heroes. And he said, he said there was tension and pressure, obviously, as you're flying towards the target because you want it to work, and there's a lot of what ifs. But once they dropped it, he said everyone relaxed, and all we did was we just had a quiet, kind of relaxed chat with one another over the intercom, just saying, well, the war's over, because there's no way they can come back from what we just dropped on them. And that's what I mean by that. It's just I just wanted to know from his grandson, how did he feel, what drove him, how did he feel after the war, did he think it was a good thing, etc., etc.
Now, we've mentioned the mayor of Hiroshima, who I think you've said was killed instantly. The moment.
Yeah.
I mean, was he sort of a puppet of the regime, or was he someone who cared deeply about the people that he was responsible for?
Well, I'm only reading his memoirs, so I'm just taking it from there. So very quickly, the background to that is he'd been a civilian administrator since he left university in the 20s. So, for nearly 20 years, he was a civilian administrator, and he specialized in running police forces. So there was several cities around Japan. He ended up doing that. So he was judicial. So if I fast forward and he's died, he had several children. 3 survived the war. His wife died as well. So 3 survived the war. And they put together his family / career memoir, I think in 1965. And there's one copy in the Tokyo National Library. And I found it when I was researching there. So we got that translated. So to get back to your question, it just tells the fact that it gives background to him in terms of he was from a very Western influenced family. His dad had worked for the American railroad companies that built the railroads in Japan when the economic boom was coming after the Great War. He, the first generation of his family to go to university, but crucially, he was a Christian. So that's only 5% of the whole of Japan, over nearly 100 million people. And one of his biggest influences on his life was a pacifist preacher in Tokyo, who even during the war he would meet every now and again just to maybe top up the batteries for how he was thinking. Because you've got to remember, I think he's a very crucial character because his story, his career, his life charts Japan's descent into totalitarianism, the expansion of the empire before Pearl Harbor, and then the war. And there's 2 or 3 really big incidents he was involved in where he's protecting the integrity of who rules Japan at home. It should be the judiciary, it should be the police and the courts. And he went head to head with some of the most powerful military leaders in Japan to say, your soldiers have to obey the law in the streets of Japan, just like I do. And it got so much for him, he took early retirement. He must have been stressed. So the government brought him out of retirement in early 43, because obviously they're thinking the tide of war has turned against us. Potentially we could be invaded or attacked. The south of Japan's where they're probably going to come. The biggest city, the most important city is Hiroshima. It's a military hub. We need a very strong administrator to take over the city. And he wasn't asked to do the job. He was told, you're going down to Hiroshima. He was from Tokyo. So that's what his memoirs say. So I'm just capturing that in the book. And don't get me wrong, I'm reading between the lines thinking, well, you did stints of service in occupied territory. So, he'd done stints of service in Korea, in the Philippines, for the Ministry of Agriculture, I think. So I would say, I would be confident in saying he was definitely a nationalist and definitely a patriot. But I think that he still had enough about him to stand his ground. I think that's what makes him different.
These were the only 2 atomic bombs to have been dropped.
Yeah.
So far. Well,
yes.
Actually, they won't be atomic anymore, will they?
No. There'll be something about 100 times worse.
Yes. So do you think that the example that the Americans set this is a lesson now that, even today, leaders are hesitant to use these weapons simply because we've seen their effects?
Yeah, it's but I think it's 80 years ago, so I don't think absolutely. I can't imagine it affects decision making today. I think it's power, isn't it? The atomic bombs at that time in 1945 were the tip of the spear point of absolute military power, and that's why the Americans had them first. That's why they wanted them. That's why they used them. And it's only when the Russians get their own bomb that you then get there's potentially catastrophic consequences if there's ever a war, and that's what's driven where we've been going for the last 80 years. I think the only thing that, if you're asking me, the only thing that really worries me today is the what ifs of it only takes one mistake, and then it's not as if either side's got 1 or 2 bombs and you only get a couple of cities destroyed. It's the end of the world as we know it. And when I was reading a lot of the information and research on the development of the Manhattan Project, and then the years afterwards, some of the real schoolboy errors that were made in the testing and the safety mechanisms in place for the early generations of of atomic, then hydrogen bombs on both sides was, playground stuff. I'm amazed that there wasn't any massive accident. And they're playing with bombs of a certain nature and a certain destructive power. And if you then ramp that up to where we are today, that's the thing that keeps me awake at night, thinking, how many bombs are now on? There's 9 countries with atomic weapons. Probably about another dozen, maybe not Iran anymore, but about a dozen that potentially could have them in the next decade, if they're allowed to have them. I don't know. it's where do we go from there? I mean, I mean, I know we're talking about Iran and America, and we're talking about Iran and Israel, but to me, I think the biggest danger at the moment is probably Pakistan and India, because they seem quite, gung ho about it and very hair trigger, and straight to DEFCON 5 as far as I can see. You've got better historians on that part of the world than me, but that's just my take from it.
Okay, kids, that's a cheery end to the podcast. But Iain, look, links are in the show notes for the Hiroshima men. It's absolutely fascinating story. It really is. And as we've just heard from Iain, I mean, very important at the moment. So Iain, thanks so much for coming on. And I'm going to hold you to a piece for our next magazine, but you'll be front page feature issue. So
it's nearly finished, actually. I'm working on it today.
Great to hear. Iain, thank you very much for coming on, and until next time.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family, and if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.